At 14:47 hours on August 18, 1944, the sky over France was a deceptive blue. Lieutenant Royce Priest adjusted his oxygen mask, squinting through the glare of the afternoon sun. Beside him, the silver wings of the 354th Fighter Squadron caught the light like polished knives. They were hunting for German supply lines, flying low and fast over the occupied countryside. Leading the flight was Major Burt Marshall, a man who seemed more legend than human. Former Texas football star and Vanderbilt All-American, he was the idol of every young pilot. Marshall had become an ace in record time, racking up 5 kills in just a few weeks. To Priest, following Marshall into battle felt like following a force of nature itself. The mission seemed routine until they reached the railway yards near the town of St. Quentin. A line of boxcars sat innocently on the tracks, some marked with the red crosses of hospital ships. Marshall signaled for a strafing run, dropping his nose to line up on the stationary target. He believed they were hitting a supply train, unaware that the train was actually hunting them. As the Mustangs dived, the sides of the railway cars suddenly collapsed like a stage set. Hidden inside were 20mm and 40mm flak cannons, already manned and tracking the American fighters. The ambush was sprung at point-blank range, turning the peaceful air into a chaotic grid of lead. "Break left," someone screamed over the radio. But for Marshall, the warning came too late. A 20mm shell hammered into the belly of Marshall's P-51 right beneath the exhaust stacks. A second round punched through the radiator scoop, the most vulnerable part of the Mustang's cooling system. Priest watched in horror as a plume of thick, oily smoke erupted from his commander's engine. The legendary Cadillac of the skies was suddenly transformed into a 9,000-pound brick. "I'm hit. Coolant's gone," Marshall's voice crackled over the radio, surprisingly calm despite the fire. He began a desperate glide toward a sprawling wheat field about 20 miles behind the German lines. Priest followed him down, his eyes darting between the burning plane and the horizon for enemy trucks. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Marshall had minutes before his engine seized completely. The 8th Air Force was losing pilots at a terrifying rate during this phase of the war. German gunners had become masters of disguise, hiding their batteries in haystacks and farm buildings. The 355th Fighter Group alone had lost 17 men in the last 2 months to these hidden traps. Priest knew that if Marshall landed, he would likely disappear into the Stalag-Luft prison system. Marshall leveled his wings, the smoke from his engine now a thick black ribbon trailing behind him. He belly landed in the golden wheat, the fuselage sliding through the stalks with a grinding roar. Dust and debris kicked up in a massive cloud as the fighter finally came to a shivering halt. Priest circled overhead, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for a sign of life. The canopy of the crashed Mustang slid back, and a figure emerged from the smoke. It was Marshall, alive and moving, though clearly shaken by the violence of the crash. He began to move away from the aircraft, knowing that the Germans would be arriving in minutes. Standard protocol dictated that Priest should record the coordinates and return to England alone. But Priest couldn't pull his eyes away from the man on the ground who had taught him everything. He looked at the wheat field. It was long enough, but the ground looked soft and dangerously uneven. "Get out of here, Priest." Marshall's voice command came through the headset, an official order to abort.
"Oh."
Priest's hand hovered over his throttle, torn between military discipline and a desperate loyalty. To land a single-seat fighter in an unmapped field was considered a suicidal maneuver by most. The P-51's landing gear was designed for concrete runways, not the shifting soil of French farmland. A single hidden rock or a deep irrigation rut would flip the plane, killing Priest instantly. Despite the risk, Priest felt a cold resolve settle over him. He wasn't going home without his leader. He banked his Mustang into a steep turn, dropping his landing gear and extending full flaps. The airspeed indicator dropped toward 90 miles per hour, the very edge of a deadly stall. He had to time the touchdown perfectly, aiming for a narrow strip of golden grain between the trees. The engine growled as he fought the controls, the heavy fighter bucking in the turbulent low-level air. The wheels touched the tops of the wheat, sending a vibration through the entire airframe. He felt the tires grab the earth, the Mustang bouncing once before settling into the soft, dark soil. Priest stood on the brakes, the scent of crushed grain filling the cockpit as the plane slowed. He came to a stop just 300 yards from where Marshall stood watching in disbelief. Priest immediately spun the aircraft around, keeping the engine running at a high idle. He knew that if he turned the engine off, the heat might cause it to vaporize the fuel and never restart. He looked toward the tree line and saw the first sign of the enemy, a cloud of dust on the road. A German military truck was racing toward the field, loaded with infantry ready to capture the pilots. Overhead, the two remaining Mustangs of the flight realized what Priest was attempting to do. Though they were low on ammunition, they rolled into a dive to protect their comrades on the ground. Their machine guns hammered, walking tracers across the road and into the front of the German truck. The vehicle swerved and crashed into a ditch, but more dust clouds appeared on the northern horizon. Marshall sprinted toward Priest's idling plane, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "You idiot, get out of here," shouted as he reached the wing, trying to wave Priest away. Priest didn't argue. Instead, he began unbuckling his own parachute and survival gear. He threw his bulky seat pack into the wheat, signaling that he was making room for a passenger. By discarding his parachute, Priest was burning his only bridge to safety if things went wrong. If the engine failed over the English Channel, he would have no way to bail out and no raft to float on. Marshall realized then that Priest would not leave the field unless they both left together. The German soldiers were now visible, jumping out of their trucks and spreading into a skirmish line. "Get in now," Priest yelled over the roar of the engine as Marshall climbed onto the wing. The cockpit of a P-51D was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was strictly built for one human. It measured only 38 inches wide, barely enough for a pilot in his bulky flight gear. They had to solve a human puzzle in seconds while bullets began to whistle over the fuselage. Marshall slid into the cockpit first, crouching down into the cramped footwell of the aircraft. He had to tuck his legs around the control stick, his back pressed against the pilot's armored plate. Priest then climbed in on top of him, sitting in his commander's lap to reach the flight controls. Their bodies were squeezed together so tightly they could barely draw a full breath in the heat. Priest reached up and slammed the sliding canopy shut, the glass clearing their helmets by an inch. The smell of sweat and high-octane fuel was overpowering in the small sealed glass bubble. He looked out and saw the Germans were now within 200 yards, firing their rifles as they ran. He jammed the throttle forward, and the Merlin engine responded with a deafening metallic scream. The Mustang was now dangerously overweight, with the mass of two full-grown men in the seat. The tires sank deep into the soft French mud, the plane struggling to gain even a little forward speed. Wheat stalks battered against the underside of the plane, threatening to clog the critical air intake. "Come on, baby, lift," Priest whispered, his hand white-knuckled on the vibrating control stick. The end of the field was approaching fast, marked by a line of tall, unforgiving oak trees. The airspeed indicator crawled upward. 70, 80, 90 miles per hour, but the plane felt heavy as lead. A Mustang normally needs 100 miles per hour to fly, but today they were carrying nearly 400 extra pounds. As the trees filled the windscreen, Priest yanked back on the stick with everything he had. The aircraft staggered into the air, the stall warning horn screaming a continuous, high-pitched note. The belly of the Mustang scraped through the uppermost branches of the trees with a sickening crunch. For a heartbeat, the plane hung in the air, seemingly undecided if it would fly or fall. Out. Then, the Merlin engine found its grip on the air, and they began a slow, agonizing climb. They were airborne, but the danger was only just beginning as they crossed the French coast. The added weight had shifted the plane's center of gravity, making it incredibly difficult to handle. Marshall was pinned beneath Priest, his legs completely losing circulation as the minutes ticked by. The cockpit was a greenhouse, and both men were soon drenched in a layer of freezing sweat. Priest looked at his gauges and saw a new problem that threatened to end their journey early. The engine temperature was soaring into the red zone because the radiator was choked with wheat. During the takeoff roll, the scoop had sucked in handfuls of stalks and debris from the field. If the engine seized now, they would both plunge into the cold, gray waters of the English Channel. They crossed the coastline near the Cotentin Peninsula, still held by German occupation forces. Flak batteries below began to open fire, sending black puffs of death into the sky around them. Priest couldn't maneuver to dodge the fire without risking a stall or crushing Marshall further. He simply held the sticks steady, praying that the German gunners were having an off day. The English Channel stretched out before them, a 20-mile expanse of unforgiving water. Without parachutes or life rafts, a ditching in the sea would be a death sentence for both pilots. The engine began to emit a rhythmic, metallic clicking sound, the sound of metal overexpanding from heat. "Hold together," Priest muttered, his eyes fixed on the distant, hazy horizon of the English shore. After nearly an hour of flying in the cramped cockpit, the white cliffs of England finally appeared. The sight brought a momentary surge of relief, but the engine was now vibrating with terrifying force. They were approaching their home base at Steeple Morden, where the ground crews were already waiting. Word had spread through the radio net that an impossible aircraft was attempting to return. Priest entered the landing pattern, knowing he would have only one chance to get the plane down. With the extra weight and the dying engine, a go-around for a second attempt was out of the question. He lowered the landing gear, feeling the heavy drag as the wheels locked into place for the final time. The runway rushed up to meet them, and Priest flared the Mustang for a perfect, gentle touchdown. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, the Merlin engine gave one final, shuddering gasp and died. Fire trucks and ambulances swarmed the plane, the crews expecting to find a disaster inside. Instead, they watched in silence as the canopy slid back and two men began to untangle themselves.
Ouch.
It was a sight that would be talked about in every pilot's mess hall for the rest of the war. Marshall had to be carried from the wing because his legs had gone completely dead from the pressure. Priest stood on the tarmac, his flight suit soaked, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. He looked at the radiator of his plane and saw it was literally stuffed with French wheat and grass. The mechanics shook their heads, amazed that the engine hadn't exploded halfway across the channel. The rescue was an unprecedented feat of airmanship that immediately drew the attention of high command. General Jimmy Doolittle, the legendary commander of the 8th Air Force, was briefed on the event. He was faced with a difficult choice: to reward the bravery or punish the total lack of discipline. Priest had disobeyed a direct order to stay in the air, and he had risked a valuable fighter. Doolittle spent 3 days reviewing the reports and talking to the other pilots in the flight. He recognized that Marshall was a vital leader whose loss would have devastated the squadron's morale. He also knew that the story of the rescue would inspire every pilot flying over occupied Europe. Ultimately, he decided that the bravery of the act outweighed the technical breach of the rules. A month later, a formal ceremony was held on the flight line at the Steeple Morden airfield. General Doolittle himself stood before the men of the 355th Fighter Group to present an award. He pinned the Distinguished Service Cross onto Royce Priest's chest as the sun set over the hangars. It was the nation's second highest award for valor, a recognition of a truly extraordinary deed. Doolittle leaned in and whispered to Priest that he was both the bravest and luckiest man in the air. He told him that if he ever tried such a stunt again, he would be court-martialed before he landed. Priest accepted the medal with a humble nod, knowing he had only done what he felt was right. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a wingman who refused to leave his leader behind. The story of the Piggyback Mustang became a part of the official legend of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Other pilots attempted similar rescues in the months that followed, though few were as successful. It proved that the bond between pilots was stronger than fear, regulations, or the enemy's guns. Marshall and Priest both survived the war, flying many more missions over the heart of Germany. Marshall went on to become a lieutenant colonel, leading his group with even greater distinction. His football hero passed, and his narrow escape in France made him a figure of immense respect. He never forgot that he owed his life and his freedom to the young lieutenant from California. The two men remained close friends for decades, bound by a secret that only they truly understood. Royce Priest continued his service in the Air Force for 28 years, retiring as a colonel. He lived a quiet life afterward, rarely boasting about the day he landed in a field in France. He eventually wrote a detailed letter to Marshall's son, Bill, explaining every detail of that day. He wanted the next generation to understand the weight of the choices made in the heat of battle. Priest passed away in 2004 at the age of 81, leaving behind a legacy of quiet courage. His obituary mentioned his long service and his many awards, but it couldn't capture the full story. The P-51 he flew that day was lost to history, likely scrapped after the war ended in 1945. But the memory of that 73-minute flight remains a testament to the power of human loyalty. We tell these stories today so that names like Royce Priest and Burt Marshall are not forgotten. They represent a generation that stood up to tyranny with nothing but skill and raw nerves. If you were moved by this story of the impossible rescue, please consider sharing it with a friend. Every time we share these accounts, we keep the spirit of these brave aviators alive for the future. The wheat field in France has likely been harvested dozens of times since that summer in 1944. The ruts left by Priest's Mustang have long since vanished beneath the plow and the new grain. Yet for those who know the history, that stretch of earth remains a sacred place of courage. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, one person's choice can change the course of a life. Imagine the silence of that field after the two Mustangs finally roared away into the western sky. The German soldiers must have stood there in total amazement, watching their prize fly away. They had the guns, the trucks, and the ground, but they had underestimated the American spirit. It was a small victory in a massive war, but it was a victory of the heart over the machine. Marshall's son, Bill, later wrote 2 books about his father's squadron to honor their memory. He included Priest's letter, ensuring that the primary source of the story was preserved forever. The details of the heat, the cramped seat, and the smell of the wheat are now recorded history. It serves as a manual for what it means to be a true brother in arms when the stakes are life. Even General Doolittle, a man who had seen everything in aviation, was touched by the event. He had led the raid on Tokyo and knew the cost of impossible missions better than anyone else. By choosing to honor Priest, he sent a message to the entire Air Force about the value of its men. He proved that, while rules are necessary, the human element is what ultimately wins a war. The mechanics who worked on Priest's plane after the rescue were the unsung heroes of the day. They spent 48 hours straight cleaning out the radiator and repairing the overheated engine. They found stalks of wheat jammed into the gun ports and wrapped around the landing gear struts. To them, the plane was a miracle of survival, a machine that refused to quit until its job was done. When we look back at World War II, we often focus on the grand maps and the massive armies. But it is these individual stories of 2 men in a single cockpit that tell the real truth of combat. It is about the fear of the prison camp and the love for a friend that makes a man land in a field. It is about the split-second decisions that define who we are for the rest of our lives. The P-51 Mustang is often called the best fighter of the war, and for good reason. It had the range to reach Berlin and the speed to outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe could fly. But on August 18th, it proved it had a different kind of strength, the ability to carry a burden. It became a lifeboat in the sky, carrying 2 souls across the waves to the safety of home. Priest's decision to throw away his life raft and parachute remains the most striking part of the tale. It was a gesture of total commitment, showing Marshall that they were truly in it together. There was no plan B, and no way for Priest to save himself if he couldn't save them both. That level of selflessness is rare in any age, and it is the core of why we remember him. Marshall's career after the rescue was marked by a renewed sense of purpose and leadership. He led his men through the toughest battles of late 1944, always flying with the same aggression. He knew that he was living on borrowed time thanks to the bravery of his wingman. He dedicated his service to making sure as many of his pilots as possible came home to their families. Today, aviation enthusiasts still study the Piggyback rescues as a curiosity of wartime history. They debate the weight limits and the stall speeds of the overloaded Mustangs in internet forums. But beyond the technical specs, there is a lesson about human potential and the refusal to give up. It shows that when we are pushed to our limits, we can find ways to do the impossible. The Distinguished Service Cross is a beautiful medal, but Priest rarely wore it in public. To him, the real reward was seeing Burt Marshall grow old and have a family of his own. The real reward was the quiet nod of respect from his fellow pilots who knew the truth. He was a man of his word, a man of his squadron, and a man who valued life over glory. If you are watching from the United States, England, or anywhere else, thank you for being here. Our community is dedicated to making sure these legends of the past are never truly silenced. We believe that by remembering these men, we inherit a little bit of their strength and character. Please leave a comment and let us know which part of this story resonated with you the most. The 8th Air Force Mighty Eighth was a collection of young men doing extraordinary things. Most were barely out of their teens, yet they carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. Royce Priest was just 21 years old when he made the decision to land in that wheat field. It is a reminder that courage does not have an age requirement, only a requirement of the heart. Think about the physical strain Marshall endured while being crushed in the floor of the cockpit. The sheer willpower it took to remain still while his body screamed for oxygen and movement. He trusted Priest implicitly, putting his life in the hands of a junior officer while he lay blind. That level of trust is the foundation of every successful military unit throughout history. The Mustang's Merlin engine was a masterpiece of British design and American manufacturing. It was built to run at high altitudes in the cold air, not to be choked with dirt on the ground. Yet it held together just long enough to cross the finish line at the steeple Morden runway. It is a reminder that even our machines can sometimes perform beyond their design when necessary. The German patrols that searched the field found only an empty plane and a discarded parachute. They must have looked at the deep ruts in the soil and realized what had happened before their eyes. In the middle of a brutal war, they had witnessed a moment of pure, unadulterated heroism. It was a message that no matter how many planes they shot down, they couldn't break the bond. When we talk about the greatest generation, we are talking about men like Royce and Burt. They didn't ask for the war, but they answered the call with everything they had to give. They faced the flak and the fire with a grim determination to see the job through to the end. And when a friend was in trouble, they didn't look at the manual. They looked at the man. The letter Priest wrote in 2002 is a precious document that provides a window into the past. He wrote it with the perspective of a man who had lived a full life and seen many things. He wanted to make sure the why was understood, not just the how of the rescue flight. He wrote about the love he had for his squadron commander and the duty he felt to save him. As the sun sets on our story today, imagine the two pilots sitting in the grass after the flight. The adrenaline had worn off, and the reality of what they had done was starting to sink in. They probably didn't say much. Sometimes the biggest moments don't require many words at all. Simple handshake and a look of mutual respect were enough to seal their bond forever. Thank you for making it to the midpoint of this tribute. To the heroes of the 355th Group, we have many more stories to tell about the innovators and the risk-takers of World War II. By subscribing, you ensure that you are there for every chapter of this incredible history. Now let's look closer at the tactical legacy that Priest left behind for the pilots who followed. After Priest's successful flight, the idea of piggybacking became a whispered possibility. Pilots across the 8th Air Force began to discuss how they would handle a similar situation. While it was never taught in flight school, it became a part of the unofficial combat doctrine, gave every man in the air a little more hope that they wouldn't be left behind in the mud. On August 28th, just 10 days later, another pilot from the same group tried a rescue. He landed his P-51 in a field to pick up a friend, but the ground was too soft for takeoff. The plane became mired in the mud, and both pilots had to flee into the woods on foot. It proved that Priest's success was a combination of incredible skill and a massive amount of luck. Another attempt in October ended in tragedy when both the rescuer and the rescued were captured. The German forces had learned to wait for the second plane to land before closing the trap. This highlighted the extreme danger that Priest had faced during those few minutes on the ground. It showed that he had truly caught the enemy by surprise during his daring landing in St. Quentin. Despite the failures, at least 5 other successful piggyback rescues were documented by the war's end. Each one was a story of a wingman refusing to accept the loss of a brother in the sky. Each one required a pilot to ignore the abort orders and trust their instincts over the radio. The legend of Royce Priest was the spark that ignited this tradition of daring battlefield rescues. The technical challenges of flying to people in a Mustang cannot be overstated by any pilot. The center of gravity is so far forward that the plane wants to tuck its nose into a deadly dive. The pilot has to use extreme back pressure on the stick just to keep the wings level and stable. Priest had to do this while his passenger's weight was actively cutting off his own circulation. Marshall's son later reflected on how different his life would have been if Priest had turned away. He wouldn't have been born, and the stories of his father's leadership would have ended in 1944. A single decision by a 21-year-old pilot impacted an entire family tree for generations. This is the ripple effect of courage that we rarely talk about in the history books today. When Priest retired in 1968, he left behind a transformed military and a very different world. He had seen the transition from propellers to jets and from world wars to the space age. But he always maintained that the basic principles of flight and friendship remained the same. He was a bridge between the old-fashioned heroism of the past and the technology of the future. The Distinguished Service Cross is now likely held by his family as a sacred heirloom of his life. It serves as a reminder that their grandfather was a man who stood up when others sat down. It is a piece of metal and ribbon that carries the weight of a 1,000-mile journey through fire. We hope that it continues to inspire them as much as it inspires all of us who hear the tale. The 355th Fighter Group, the Steeple Morden Strafers, was one of the top units in the war. They were known for their aggressive tactics and their willingness to go low against the flak. Priest and Marshall were the perfect embodiments of that group's fierce and loyal spirit. They proved that the most dangerous weapon in the sky is a pilot who cares about his wingman. We often think of the P-51 as a long-range escort, but it was also a deadly ground attack plane. The mission on August 18th was designed to cripple the German infrastructure before the breakout. It was dangerous, dirty work that required flying just feet above the trees and the power lines. This environment created a unique bond between the men who shared the risks of the low level. Imagine the heat inside that cockpit during the climb back to 8,000 feet over France. With 2 men breathing and sweating in a small space, the glass would have been fogging up. Priest had to constantly wipe the canopy with his glove just to see the escort planes beside him. Every breath was a struggle as they shared the limited oxygen available in the cramped quarters. The 2 escort pilots who stayed overhead during the landing were essential to the rescue's success. By suppressing the German trucks, they bought Priest the few seconds he needed to get Marshall. They watched the entire drama unfold from the air, unable to help except with their machine guns. They were the silent witnesses to one of the greatest acts of bravery in the history of flight. When the plane finally reached Steeple Morden, the entire base seemed to hold its collective breath. The tower operators watched through binoculars as the overloaded Mustang wobbled on its final approach. They knew that if Priest crashed on the runway, they would lose two of their finest men at once. The silence that followed the landing was broken only by the cheers of the men on the ground. Marshall's legs took several days to fully recover from the intense pressure and lack of blood. He spent that time in the infirmary, reflecting on the fact that he was lucky to be alive. He reportedly told Priest that he was the most magnificent idiot he had ever had the pleasure to meet. It was the highest compliment one combat pilot could ever give to another in the heat of war. The German hospital train ruse was a war crime that the pilots never forgot or forgave. Using the Red Cross symbol to hide anti-aircraft guns was a violation of the Geneva Convention. It made the pilots even more determined to strike back and protect their own from such treachery. Priest's rescue was a direct response to that kind of dishonorable and deadly warfare. The mighty 8th Air Force was a community of nearly 200,000 men at its peak in 1944. In such a large organization, it is easy for an individual to feel like just a number or a gear. But stories like Priest's remind us that the individual still matters more than the machine. One man's skill and one man's heart can save a leader and inspire 1,000 other souls. If you are a veteran or currently serving, we salute you and thank you for your commitment. We know that the bond described in this story is something you understand better than anyone. Please share this video with your fellow service members to honor the tradition of the wingman. Let them know that their dedication to their comrades is noticed and respected by all of us. The P-51 Mustang Cripes Almighty was the name of another famous Aces plane in the group. The 355th was full of colorful characters and incredible machines that won the war in the air. But none of them had a story quite like the unnamed Mustang that carried 2 men home. It was the workhorse of the squadron, performing a miracle when everything else had failed. The physics of the landing in the wheat field are a study in the limits of mechanical stress. The landing gear struts were never meant to take a landing on soft, clumpy soil at high speed. If one tire had blown, the plane would have ground-looped and disintegrated in the golden grain. Priest's hands on the controls were described by witnesses as nothing short of supernatural. Marshall's role as a quarterback in Texas taught him the value of a team and a protector. He knew that you were only as good as the people who were willing to stand in the gap for you. On the football field, it was the offensive line. In the sky over France, it was Royce Priest. Recognized that Priest had blocked for him in the most dangerous game of his entire life. The radiator scoop of the P-51 was its Achilles heel, as even a small bird could disable it. The fact that it swallowed a massive amount of wheat and didn't fail immediately is a marvel. It speaks to the quality of the Allison and Packard engineers who built these engines for war. They built them with a margin of error that allowed for the impossible to happen just once. Priest's letter to Bill Marshall in 2002 was one of his last major acts before he passed away. He seemed to know that the clock was running out on the living memory of the Great War. He wanted to leave a clear record so that no one could say the story was just a wartime myth. He was a man who valued truth and accuracy as much as he valued his life and his friends. When we visit the museums today and see the restored Mustangs, they look clean and perfect. But we should imagine them as they were, oil-streaked, battle-scarred, and smelling of cordite. We should imagine the cramped cockpit of Priest's plane, soaked with the sweat of 2 heroes. These were not toys. They were the tools of a very hard and very necessary business. The decision to recommend the Distinguished Service Cross instead of the Medal of Honor was wise. It protected the lives of other pilots by not encouraging everyone to land in enemy fields. But it also ensured that Priest's name would be recorded among the highest heroes of the nation. It was a balanced decision by General Doolittle that respected both the man and the mission. Marshall's football career at Vanderbilt was cut short by the war, but he never complained. He took the lessons he learned on the gridiron and applied them to the squadron he led. He knew how to motivate men, how to take a hit, and how to get back up for the next play. His rescue by Priest was the ultimate comeback in a game where the score was life or death. The landscape of St. Quentin is now peaceful, a place of farming and quiet country roads. The scars of the flak batteries and the crash sites have been healed by the passing of time. But the story of August 18, 1944, is still whispered by those who study the history of flight.
Oh.
It is a ghost story in the best sense of memory of a time when men were truly giant. Priest's wife, Anita, whom he met in Chile, was the anchor of his life after the long war. She saw the man behind the medals and the colonel who had once been a daring young pilot. Their life together was a testament to the peace that these men fought so hard to establish. She was the witness to his quiet dignity and his refusal to be defined only by his combat years. The 354th Fighter Squadron still carries the heritage of men like Marshall and Priest today. They remember the bulldog spirit that defined their unit during the dark days over Europe. They know that their foundation was built on the loyalty of a wingman to his squadron leader. It is a tradition that continues to guide the next generation of pilots in the modern age. As we move toward the conclusion of our narrative, let's reflect on the word unauthorized. The best moments in history often happen when someone has the courage to be unauthorized. When the situation is dire and the rules don't fit, the human spirit must take the lead. Royce Priest was unauthorized, and because of that, a great leader was saved for the world. The mathematics of the 73-minute flight are a blur of high temperatures and low fuel. Every minute was a miracle, and every mile was a victory over the laws of aerodynamics. Priest was essentially flying a brick with wings, managing a stall speed that was rising. It was a feat of manual piloting that would challenge even the best test pilots of today. The Piggyback rescue remains one of the most unique chapters in the annals of the 8th. It stands out because it wasn't about shooting things down, but about lifting a brother up. In a war defined by destruction, it was a moment of pure, constructive human effort. It was about the preservation of life in the midst of a global struggle to survive the night. Marshall's service in Japan after the war helped rebuild a nation that had once been the enemy. He showed the same leadership in peace that he had shown in the fire of the dogfights. He was a man of character who understood that the end of the war was just the beginning. He lived a long and fruitful life, never taking a single day for granted after the wheat field. The radiator scoop on Priest's plane had to be completely disassembled by the ground crew. They found that the cooling fins were bent and the airflow was less than 30%. The fact that the engine didn't melt into a solid block of aluminum is purely a miracle. It was as if the machine itself knew that it had 2 lives on board that it had to protect. Priest's modesty was his most defining trait, according to those who knew him in his later years. He didn't wear his uniform to the grocery store or tell his story to everyone he met. He was a quiet professional who did his job and expected nothing more than a job well done. This is the hallmark of the men who truly changed the world during the middle of the century. We hope this story encourages you to look into your own family's history and their service. Many of us have heroes in our family trees whose stories have never been fully told or recorded. By asking questions and doing research, you keep their memories from fading into the dust. Every veteran deserves to have their story told with the same respect we give to Royce Priest. The mighty 8th Museum in Georgia preserves the memory of these men for future visitors. They have displays that show the cramped cockpits and the terrifying flak they had to face. If you ever have the chance to visit, you will gain a new appreciation for Priest's flight. You will see just how small that space was and how impossible it was for 2 men to fit. Marshall's quarterback record in Texas is still remembered by sports historians in the state. But he would tell you that his greatest pass was the one he made into Priest's cockpit. His greatest touchdown was the one he made on the runway at Steeple Morden Airfield. He was a man who excelled at every challenge he was given, whether on grass or in the air. The friendship between the 2 men lasted over 60 years, a bond that never wavered once. They saw each other through the trials of peace and the challenges of raising their families. They were brothers in the truest sense of the word, forged in the furnace of a French field. Their story is a beautiful reminder that the best things in life are the people we love. As we approach the final scenes, take a moment to imagine the medal ceremony once again. The sun is low, and the wind is blowing across the concrete of the English Air Base in 1944. A young man stands tall, his chest swelling as the general pins the silver cross to his suit. He isn't thinking about the medal, he's thinking about the man standing in the crowd. Royce Priest and Bert Marshall are no longer with us, but their spirit lives on in this story. It lives on every time a pilot helps a wingman or a friend stands up for a brother in need. It is a universal story of loyalty that transcends the specific details of the Second World War. It is a story for all time, for all people, and for anyone who believes in the power of good. The P-51 Mustang will always be remembered as the plane that won the air war over Europe. But to us, it will always be the Piggyback plane that carried two heroes to their safety. It was a vessel of mercy, a silver bird that refused to let the darkness win that afternoon. It is a symbol of the ingenuity and the courage that defines the best of our shared history. If you are watching this, you are now a guardian of the story of the 73-minute flight. You have the responsibility to make sure that the names Priest and Marshall are spoken again. By hitting that like button and sharing this, you are doing your part to honor their sacrifice. Thank you for being a part of this community and for caring about the heroes of the past. The wheat of France continues to grow, and the skies over St. Quentin are now silent. But if you listen closely to the wind, you might hear the ghost of a Merlin engine roaring. You might see the shadow of a Mustang banking low over the trees, heading home to England. The past is never truly gone as long as there are people willing to remember the truth. Marshall's Vanderbilt jersey and Priest's flight suit are artifacts of a different time. But the men who wore them were just like us, full of dreams, fears, and a will to survive. They didn't set out to be legends. They just set out to do what was right in the moment. That is the most important lesson of all. Greatness is found in the choices we make today. Doolittle's raid on Tokyo and Priest's rescue in France are two sides of the same coin. Both required a total disregard for the impossible and a focus on the goal at hand. Both were led by men who refused to accept defeat, no matter how high the odds were stacked. They are the bookends of a conflict that was won by the sheer force of the human imagination. The ground crews who rebuilt the engine should be remembered as the doctors of the plane. They worked in the cold hangars, their hands covered in grease, to heal the battle-scarred bird. They knew that the plane was more than just metal. It was a survivor of a miraculous journey. Their dedication ensured that the Mustang would fly again and continue the fight for freedom. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world celebrated with a joy that is hard to imagine. But for Priest and Marshall, the celebration had already happened on that runway in 1944. They had already won their most important battle, the battle to keep each other alive and well. The rest of the war was just a long road toward the peace they had already secured for themselves. The Distinguished Service Cross citation for Priest is a document of cold military prose. But between the lines, you can feel the heat of the fire and the desperation of the takeoff. You can see the German soldiers closing in and the trees rushing toward the tiny windscreen. It is a masterpiece of historical recording that preserves the essence of a hero's heart. Marshall's son Bill continues to honor his father's legacy through his writing and research. He is the bridge that keeps the story alive for the third and fourth generations of the family. He reminds us that we are all the products of the courage that came before us in the past. He is a reminder that the stories we tell our children are the most important things we own. The 355th Fighter Group Association still gathers to remember their fallen and their heroes. They tell the story of the Piggyback Mustang with a pride that hasn't faded in 80 years. They are the keepers of the flame, the men who know what it truly costs to win the war. We are honored to help them share their history with a wider world through this channel. Royce Priest's service in Chile as a presidential pilot showed his skill was world-class. He was trusted with the lives of leaders because he had proven he could handle any crisis. He was a man of the world who never lost his humble roots or his loyalty to his friends. He was the perfect representative of the American military in the years after the victory. Think about the moment the canopy finally opened after the two pilots landed at the base. The rush of cool English air must have felt like the breath of life itself after the heat. The sound of the sirens and the voices of the crew must have been the sweetest music. They were home, they were safe, and they had done something that no one else had ever done. The P-51's bubble canopy was a revolution that gave pilots 360-degree visibility in the air. On that day, it also gave two men a front-row seat to a miracle of survival in flight. It was the glass house that protected them from the wind and the bullets of the enemy. It was the window through which they watched their own survival unfold in the French sky. We often ask ourselves what we would do if we were in Royce Priest's shoes that day. Do we follow the orders and fly away, or would we take the risk and land in the wheat? It is a question that defines the difference between a good pilot and a legendary wingman. Priest gave us the answer, and in doing so, he set the bar for all of us to follow. As we come to the end, let's say the names one more time: Royce Priest and Bert Marshall. Let the names echo in your mind as a symbol of everything that is good and brave in us. They are not just names in a book. They are the heart and soul of the mighty Eighth. They are the reason we continue to search the archives for the stories that really matter. The final flight of the Piggyback Mustang may have ended in a scrapyard long ago, but in the world of history and memory, that plane is still flying, high and proud and free. It is still carrying two men home, and it is still teaching us about the power of love. It is a story that will never crash, never burn, and never be forgotten by those who hear it. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your respect for the veterans of World War II. We hope you have enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most incredible rescues in history. Please subscribe and turn on the notifications so you don't miss our next tactical legend. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, and we can't wait to share them with you. Tell us in the comments, if you had to rescue a friend, would you take the authorized path? Or would you be like Royce Priest and make your own way through the wheat and the fire? Your engagement helps us grow and allows us to reach even more people with these memories. We read every single comment, and we appreciate the community we are building here together. Royce Priest, Colonel, United States Air Force, we salute you for your daring and your heart. Bert Marshall, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, we salute you for your leadership. Together you showed us that the impossible is just a challenge waiting for a brave soul. May you rest in peace, knowing that your story is still being told and still being honored. This has been the story of the 73-minute gauntlet, the piggyback flight that changed history. Remember the wheat, remember the Mustang, and most of all, remember the bond of the wingman. From all of us here, thank you for watching and for keeping the fire of history burning bright. We will see you in the next video where the legends of the sky come to life once again.